Hello, this is Andrea Walsh, and I am here to give a brief history on the special education laws for students with disabilities prior to the 1970s and from the 1970s until present day. Special education is tailored to meet the needs of students with disabilities, and although some individuals may feel that the services and support that their children receive today have always been implemented, that is not the case. In fact, if you go back as far as the early 1800s, any students that were viewed as disabled or differently abled from other children in the general population, they were more often than not segregated in the classroom or generally not allowed to attend school at all. In fact, if you fast forward all the way until the 1970s, there were at least 8 million documented children diagnosed as or viewed as disabled, and over 3 million of them did not receive a proper education at all. In fact, it wasn't until 1965 when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was enacted by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And it represented a major new commitment to the federal government to quality and equality for all students, and declared the national goal for full educational opportunity. The purpose of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was to provide additional resources for vulnerable students, and it offered new grants to districts serving low-income students, federal grants for textbooks and library books, created special education centers, and also created scholarships for low-income families and students. The law also provided federal grants to state educational agencies to improve the quality of elementary and secondary education, and established free and reduced lunch program, along with additional teachers for low-income schools to meet the needs for the expanding student population. In 1975 came about the Rehabilitation Act, also known as Section 404, which was the first disability civil rights law to be enacted in the United States. It prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in programs that receive federal financial assistance, and set the stage for enactment of the American Disabilities Act. Section 404 works together with the American Disabilities Act, the ADA, and the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, to protect children and adults with disabilities from exclusion and unequal treatment in schools, jobs, and in the community. The Education Amendments Act of 1974 was enacted by President Ford to balance federal aid among local districts and to ensure education in a least restrictive environment for all children, and began the movement of equal rights for students within schools and government. The Education Amendments Act of 1974 provides students and their families the right to due process in special education cases, and also grants federal funding for gifted and talented students as well. In 1975 saw the enactment of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act by the United States Congress. The act required all public schools except federal funds to provide equal access to education for children with physical and mental disabilities. Public schools were required to evaluate children with disabilities and create an educational plan with parent input that would emulate as closely as possible the educational experience of those non-disabled students. The act also required the school districts to provide administrative procedures so that parents of disabled children could dispute decisions made about their child's education. The act also contains a provision that disabled students should be placed in the least restricted environment, one that allows for maximum possible opportunity to interact with non-disabled students. In 1986, the Education and Handicap Amendments was begun, which ensures that free and appropriate education for students with disabilities ages 3 through 5, and provides intervention programs for children with disabilities from birth to 2 years of age as well. In 1990, the American with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA, became law, which is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities and provides equal opportunity in all public life, including jobs, school, transportation, and the public and private places that are open to the general public. The Individual with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA, of 1990, is comprised of 6 main elements for individuals with disabilities, such as the Individualized Education Program, the IEP, the Free and Appropriate Public Education, FAPE, ensures a least restrictive environment is provided for students and that there are appropriate evaluation of students with disabilities and exceptionalities. It also fosters parent and teacher participation, and that procedural safeguards are implemented in a school environment. To accompany those 6 main elements, there are also a few other important components that tie into IDEA. Confidentiality of information, transition services for those students 16 years of age or older, and discipline plans as well. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1997 was an amendment to IDEA of 1990 and requires that every state have in effect policies and procedures to ensure that free and appropriate education is in place for all students with disabilities. School districts have obligations to ensure benefits to students with disabilities who are placed by their parents in private schools, but at the same time it does not impose requirements on the private schools, but just that these services are made available to them. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 and included provisions which pertain to disabled and disadvantaged students. It is based on the premise that setting high standards and establishing measurable goals could improve individual outcomes in education. It requires states to develop assessments in basic skills, and they receive federal school funding. And to receive federal school funding, the states had to give these assessments to all students at select grade levels. It provides early intervention in reading programs, school choice for students from failing schools, as well as providing highly qualified teachers to instruct these students. The IDEA Improvement Act, IDEIA of 2004, mandates that equity, accountability, and excellence is present in education for children with disabilities. Signed into law by President George W. Bush, it ensures higher standards for education, special education teachers, licensures and certification, and increased funding to early intervention, and utilizes the RTI, the response to intervention. Following this in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, is a U.S. law passed in December of that year that governs the United States K-12 public education. Public education policy. The law replaced the predecessor, the No Child Left Behind Act, and modified but did not eliminate provisions relating to the periodic standardized tests given to students. Like the No Child Left Behind Act, the ESSA is a reorganization of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which established the federal government's expanded role in public education and gives more control to the states in terms of standardized testing and the consequences for low performance, and implements bullying prevention plans as well. What brought about many of these changes also took place due to some landmark cases in history due to focus on special education. For instance, in 1972, PARC, which is the Pennsylvania Association of Retarded Citizens versus Pennsylvania, found that states cannot deny mentally retarded children access to free or public education. Also in 1972, the Mills versus the Board of Education found that schools must provide supplemental services needed for children to attend school at no cost to the parent. In 1982, the Board of Education of Hudson versus Raleigh found that schools must provide sufficient and the best possible education to all students. In 1988, Honing versus Doe ruled that schools cannot expel students based on the behaviors related to their disabilities. I hope you found this presentation informative, and thank you so much.